In the dark, unforgiving heart of the London underworld, during the gritty, smoke-filled decade of the late 20th century, there existed an invisible boundary that simply could not be crossed. It was an unwritten, unspoken line drawn not by the official authorities of Scotland Yard, nor by the robed judges of the High Courts, but by the violent, terrifying shadows that ruled the streets after midnight. In those volatile days, if you were an active criminal operating on the edge of the law, you could easily hide from the police. You could pay off the crooked, greedy detectives on the take. You could navigate the treacherous, shifting alliances of the neighborhood street gangs and find a way to survive the daily chaos. But there was one legendary name whose single mention was enough to freeze the blood of the city's most ruthless and hardened criminals. Anthony "Lenny" the McLean. On the streets, they called him the Governor. He was not a distant corporate mob boss who hid behind a desk. He was the most feared, devastating bare-knuckle fighter in British history. A massive, towering human mountain who didn't just win physical altercations, he systematically dismantled men with his bare hands. He was a terrifying force of nature who had spent decades clearing entire crowded barrooms and nightclubs with nothing but his massive, heavy, unprotected fists. For generation after generation, every single thief, burglar, and enforcer in London knew that Lenny McLean was an absolute sovereign. His brutal reputation was a shield that protected his family, and his home was considered an untouchable fortress of respect. But on a freezing, damp British winter night, a desperate, reckless group of local suburban thieves made a monumental, fatal mistake in judgment. They didn't see a living legend when they looked at the house, they just saw an easy opportunity for a fast payout. They thought his residence was just another wealthy, unprotected target sitting in a quiet, dark neighborhood. They foolishly assumed the giant was far away from the property, thoroughly distracted by his extensive security business in the city's neon-lit, chaotic nightclubs. They broke their way through the rear perimeter, shattered the quiet sanctuary of his family, and laid their greedy, disrespectful hands on his wife's private belongings. They turned her personal rooms completely upside down, aggressively ripping open drawers and scattering her private life all over the floor. As they drove away into the thick London fog, they genuinely believed they had just pulled off the perfect, quiet heist of a lifetime. They were casually counting their stolen loot in the back of a getaway vehicle, laughing in the dark, completely unaware of the horrifying reality they had just unleashed upon themselves. They did not realize that by touching that specific house, and by violating the privacy of that specific woman, they had just signed their own physical death warrants. Because Lenny McLean didn't call the police. He didn't wait for the slow, bureaucratic, inefficient wheels of British justice to turn. He had a much more personal, brutal, and immediate punishment in mind. A retribution that would leave the entire underworld gasping for air. To truly understand the sheer, unadulterated madness of what these thieves did that night, you have to understand exactly who Lenny McLean was to the culture of Great Britain. For an audience accustomed to the historical stories of the American mafia, criminal masterminds like Tony Accardo or Al Capone ruled through an empire of corporate silence and distance. They were multimillionaires who sat in highly fortified, luxury mansions, deeply insulated by layers of capos, soldiers, and professional hitmen. They wore tailored Italian suits and ordered sudden deaths with a casual, silent nod of the head across a lavish dinner table. But Lenny McLean was an entirely different breed of underworld royalty. He was the raw, physical enforcement itself. He was the man who stood on the front lines of the Ashford War, a living monument to survival and raw dominance. Standing at nearly 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing well over 280 pounds of dense, weathered, scarred muscle, Lenny ruled the pubs, clubs, and security networks of London's East End with an iron hand that nobody dared to challenge. He was the definitive man the syndicate called when a situation became completely unmanageable for ordinary criminals. His heavy fists were the stuff of street mythology. He had fought in thousands of illegal, highly dangerous bare-knuckle boxing matches where there were no protective gloves, no official referees, and absolutely no mercy. He had survived multiple deep stabbings, he had survived being shot at close range, and he had sent dozens of grown men straight to the intensive care units of London's municipal hospitals. Yet, despite the savage, bloody nature of his daily profession, Lenny McLean lived his life by a strict, unyielding, old-school code of street honor that was deeply respected across the entire British criminal landscape. In his world, the streets belonged to the streets. Physical violence stayed strictly between men who willingly chose to live that dangerous life. But family? Family was completely sacred. A man's wife and children were entirely off-limits to any true professional. Your home was your ultimate sanctuary, the one single place on earth where a violent, targeted man could finally drop his guard, look at his loved ones, and know they were completely safe from the horrors of the world. These local thieves weren't just taking jewelry, gold, or paper cash. They were actively trampling over the dignity of a man who had spent his entire life proving that he was the apex predator of the city. They honestly thought they were just robbing a normal house, but they were actually pulling the pin on a human grenade, waiting for the blast to consume them. When Lenny McLean finally returned to his residence that evening, the heavy air in the hallway instantly shifted. The front door frame was badly splintered, the metal lock hanging uselessly by a single bent screw. As he stepped across the threshold, the absolute silence of the house was deafening to his ears. He didn't find his wife crying in a corner. She fortunately wasn't there at the time, which was the only stroke of absolute luck the thieves had during that entire fateful night. But as he walked with heavy steps into their private quarters, he saw the total destruction of his domestic peace. The wooden drawers where his wife kept her most personal, intimate items had been violently yanked out, flipped over, and completely emptied onto the floor. Her dresses were scattered, trodden on by the dirty, muddy boots of total strangers. Her small pieces of sentimental jewelry, items that carried absolutely no massive street value but held years of family memories, were completely gone. For a man of Lenny's immense stature, this was not a financial loss to weep over. He had plenty of money flowing from his legitimate and illegitimate businesses. This was a direct, psychological assault on his manhood. It was an insult specifically designed, whether the thieves knew it or not, to show the world that he could not protect his own private domain. Anyone else living in London would have immediately picked up the plastic telephone receiver and dialed 999 for Scotland Yard. The police would have eventually arrived with their flashing blue lights, taken technical fingerprints, dusted the wooden furniture, and filed a standard bureaucratic report that would sit on a cold desk for months. The neighbors expected the loud police sirens. But Lenny McLean just stood there in the absolute middle of the ruined bedroom, his massive, scarred hands clenching into fists so incredibly hard that his skin stretched and his knuckles turned pure white. The local police detectives actually caught wind of the suburban break-in through their street informants and proactively offered to open an official criminal investigation, knowing the highly volatile, explosive nature of the giant homeowner. They wanted to prevent a street war before it started. But Lenny looked the lead investigator dead in the eyes and calmly, coldly declined the offer. In his own words, written years later in his best-selling memoirs, calling the police was an act reserved strictly for victims. It was for people who relied on the state to fight their battles because they couldn't fight themselves. Lenny McLean was his own judge, his own jury, and he was about to become an executioner of flesh and bone. He walked out of the house into the cold, pouring London rain, leaving the shattered front door completely wide open behind him. He didn't need forensic science or detective magnifying glasses. He knew the criminal underworld inside and out, and he knew that in a dense city built entirely on dirty secrets, someone always talks when the stakes are this high. Lenny McLean did not assemble a heavily armed crew of hitmen to do his bidding. He did not buy illegal firearms from the corrupt docks of the River Thames. He simply put on his heavy, dark leather coat, clenched his jaw, and hit the neon-lit, rain-slicked streets of London completely alone. He moved through the criminal underworld like an unstoppable ghost of pure vengeance, systematically targeting the notorious drinking dens, the underground gambling clubs, and the backroom pubs where the city's fences, thieves, and low-level informants gathered to trade information. He didn't ask his questions politely, nor did he offer money for tips. He walked into smoke-filled establishments, ignored the bartenders, grabbed the local criminal bosses directly by their leather lapels, and lifted them completely off the wooden floor until their feet dangled in the air. In the delicate criminal ecosystem of London, abstract loyalty completely evaporates the exact moment that real, physical terror enters the room. No street criminal was willing to take a devastating beating or lose their life just to protect a couple of petty, low-level independent thieves who had been incredibly stupid enough to rob the home of the governor. Within less than 3 hours of hunting, the names, descriptions, and the current exact location of the thieves were handed over to Lenny on a silver platter by terrified associates. The thieves were hiding out in a small, secluded apartment on the outskirts of the industrial district, casually celebrating their haul, drinking cheap alcohol from the bottle, completely oblivious to the massive physical storm that was tearing through the city streets directly toward them. When the front door of their hideout was literally blown clean off its hinges by a single, catastrophic kick from a heavy boot, the thieves turned around expecting to see a tactical police raid. Instead, they saw the towering, massive, terrifying silhouette of Lenny McLean filling the entire doorway, blocking out the light from the hallway. There were no verbal warnings given. There were no dramatic demands for the return of the stolen jewelry. There was only immediate, systematic, and catastrophic physical destruction. Lenny didn't use firearms or knives because his bare hands were deadlier than any blunt instrument found on the streets. He trapped them inside the small room, locking the exit with his massive body. He systematically broke their bodies apart piece by piece. He shattered their jaws with single, precise punches, cracked their ribs like dry winter twigs under a boot, and left them completely incapacitated, screaming for mercy on the blood-stained concrete floor of the room. He deliberately didn't kill them because death would mean an immediate end to their suffering. He wanted them to live the rest of their days on this earth remembering the exact, agonizing cost of entering his home. When the emergency paramedics finally arrived at the bloody scene hours later, tipped off by an anonymous, terrified call from a neighbor who had heard the screams, they described the interior of the apartment as an absolute, industrial slaughterhouse. The thieves survived the horrific encounter, but their criminal careers were permanently, definitively over. They spent consecutive months in the intensive care units of London's largest hospitals, their shattered faces and broken limbs held together by complex, permanent networks of titanium metal plates, surgical wires, and heavy medical screws. They left the hospital halls with permanent, horrific physical disfigurement, a lifelong, unbending reminder of the night they chose the absolute wrong house to rob. Lenny McLean had sent a definitive, crystal-clear message to the entire British underworld that echoed for decades. Some men are simply too dangerous to cross, no matter how old they get or how quiet they seem. Because when you violate the sanctuary of the governor, the law of the land is the absolute least of your worries. If you want to discover the deep, completely unmasked historical true stories behind the world's most terrifying criminal masterminds, make sure to listen closely to our next episode. Hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week, we drop a brand new, thoroughly researched, and completely uncensored true crime audio documentary exploring the dark reality of the global underworld. Leave a comment below right now. Which legendary mob boss do you want to hear completely exposed in our next video?